Recording is on.
I will be sharing with you this time something which is in a relatively early stages of researching, and it is in a way you can say offshoot of the main line of research, which has something to do, which I actually a number of times mentioned while being here. The issue we had not only in Poland, but also in several other Eastern European countries with bourgeois classes. We are type of societies which were unfortunate with the proper establishment of the class structure. At least in a way it is defined in the Western Europe and the Western world, with the lacking proper component that is bourgeois class. And this research is being carried out with a colleague of mine from the University of Warsaw, with Tomasz Zarycki. And we are particularly concerned with Jewish bourgeois, to a certain extent also German origin bourgeois, which dominated you can say, the emergence of bourgeois in historical Polish lands, mainly under control of Russian Empire in late 19th century and early 20th century. And they achieved, I'm just sharing a few, because this is not a major, this is like an introduction I just mentioned. This is what we are doing in a main line of this research. But I'm going to talk only about Jewish revival in Poland after 1989 communist collapse, yes, which is something else actually. But the major research is related to what I just said, trying to understand the conditions of the emergence of the Polish bourgeois, even though this Polish bourgeois was dominated at that time, late 19th century and early 20th century, by members of the community of Jewish origin and German origin. They, in early stages at least, because if we are looking at them in a synchronic manner, they poorly even spoke Polish, right, at that time. Polish Jewry of Ashkenazi origin were mainly speaking Yiddish, and Germans were speaking German, right? But they dominated. They have significant amounts of capital to start businesses. And what is quite interesting, that these businesses, as we are studying this, which is not easy because you have to compute all these assets according to the relevance of wealth at that time and to compare it to the current situation, which is a complicated, of course, thing and debatable. So, but what we see is that the accumulation of wealth, these members of these families managed to gather and then reinvest in several different establishments, were to a certain extent actually competitive to what was going on at that time in the Western world. Yes. So this was entirely different what we are observing, for instance, with the emergence of so-called Polish bourgeois these days, which is relatively underfunded, heavily controlled by the Western financial resources. In fact, in my opinion, and in several other scholars' opinion, they don't constitute a proper bourgeois. In fact, they are rather comprador type of class, only being representative of the Western capital. But those people, I'm just referring, and this research is slowly developing the story of these people, which was, as we know, stopped first by Bolshevik Revolution, First World War, and later on introduction of communism, which changed everything, were definitely by standards of the late 19th century and early 20th century, relatively competitive what was going on also in the major centers of the capital accumulation in the Western world. And in the diachronic way, if we look at these families, they Polonized. in most cases. Yes, so this either German families or Jewish families, their children and certainly their grandchildren, they Polonized, but also they assumed new class positions. So if we look at them in the very beginning, initially as the representatives of the early stages capitalist class emerging in Eastern Europe, their children quite often continue this sense of capitalist identity because they were still in charge of running these factories, mines, mill steels, big businesses. Grandchildren usually already spoke Polish and they assumed positions of the intelligentsia. And certainly the grandchildren and grandchildren, which we are dealing at the moment, were already proper intelligentsia members in the communist Poland, right? And at the moment in the so-called Third Republic of Poland. Okay, so this is something else. I will start my presentation in a typical and we are already familiar manner. So I will talk not more than half an hour, maybe not to bother you. And later on, we will turn into most exciting phase of all seminars we are having, that is discussion. So I'm expecting feedback and everything else. So starting with some, you can say, historical context where we are at the moment, because I will be talking about this Jewish revival after 1989 in Poland. First, that was sort of unexpected and some could even say strange situation to see this revival, because according to the common knowledge, but also historical knowledge, we before 1989 believed that there is no anything like Jewish community in Poland. Yes. First of all, as we know, because of the tragic events of Holocaust. And later on, because some hundreds of thousands Jews survived Holocaust, they migrated in a certain waves which came out possible after Second World War, yes, mainly in 1940s and 1950s. And these waves of migration constitute mainly of people who identified themselves as proper Jewish nationals. Even though some of them could have spoken Polish, but their main language was Yiddish. Their cultural definition also was Jewish. So those who remained after this Holocaust events and later on this migration waves, seeking for better life in the Western world, mainly in Israel, Western world, usually identified themselves as Polish nationals. Yes. And when anti-Semitic campaign came in 1968, and as a result, there were several thousands of people forced to migrate from Poland. These were mainly people who were forced to be seen as Jews because they, in the first place, believed to be Polish nationals. Unfortunately, anti-Semitic campaign didn't allow them to maintain as Polish nationals. And after 1968, it was believed basically that there are no Jews. Therefore, it is so surprising that we are witnessing these days a Jewish revival, yes, with significant number of Jewish organizations, both secular, related to cultural issues, but also religious. Even those religious are diversified in terms of adherence to either mainstream Orthodox Judaism or Reform Judaism, and even more eccentric type of Judaism you can think of, with women rabbis and all these things. Moreover, this is not a niche thing, because also when we think about public presence of topics related to Jewish issues, whether, for instance, the Holocaust legacy, the Polish anti-Semitism studies, but also the proper historical studies of so-called shtetl settlements. I don't know whether you are familiar with this category of shtetl. Shtetl is in Yiddish meaning small towns where petty commerce was taking place, usually associated with significant, maybe not misery, but at least poverty. Yes. These were not specifically wealthy Jewish communities. So all this constitute also an academic field of concern, of studies, of research. Then, many of these initiatives I'm referring to were funded by the Polish state, with erecting a major museum in Warsaw called Polin, which is about to celebration, but also educational initiatives, programs, and so on about the history of the Polish Jewry. Yes? So we are having something significant. But, and this is my line of argument, I'm claiming that the very presence and the very revival, not denying the genuine self-reporting identity of many of those people involved in this revival, but in my opinion, and this is the line of argument I'm working at the moment, has been conditioned by, as always, by the specific position of Polish intelligentsia. So it has less to do with ethnographic or ethnic identity stuff, but it has more to do with Polish intelligentsia status games. And Jewishness as such has been used as one of the symbolic resources which is capitalized in these status symbolic games. And this is the very core of my presentation, but don't worry, I'm not going to go on and go on. I will just give you several hints linking it to semi-peripheral position of Poland, where the intelligentsia class constitutes the major collective actor understood as a national and political and moral leader. And they are referring to this type of symbolic resources quite often. And in a way, this is a follow-up of what I also talked with you earlier, where it came down to this noble or szlachta type of legacy. In my opinion, this is a similar way of game. However, of course, the devil is in detail, right? So the Jewishness has different symbolic status, but functionally speaking, it is similar status game using certain valuable symbolic resources in semi-peripheral Eastern European country, where the proper class hierarchy has been disturbed. And instead of the prominent material capital resources, symbolic resources, cultural capital resources are in the first place for the class differentiation, status positioning, and so on and so forth. So, and this is the very, very clue why it might be interesting. Therefore, we are not talking, we are confronted with this type of ambiguities, because in the Western world where you have potentially, you have a proper class hierarchy, it might be looked at in a more straight way. You have a proper ethnographic type of study where you have collective identities reconstructed after some historical maladies, collapses, and so on. But in Eastern European thing, we are dealing with this type of grayness where the collective identities are being played around, especially after what I just said, this maladies. Okay, so now I will share you with some lines of arguments to support this vision that we are in fact not dealing only with Jewish revival, but we are dealing with another phase of the intelligentsia game, which helps them to reproduce the hegemonic position. In this case, they are just referring to the certain symbolic resources which are giving them upper hand within the context of neoliberal hegemony, yes, where Jewishness as such is perceived as a symbolic asset, at least in the Polish context, as a social innovativeness and modernization. So this is a good resource, particularly for Polish neoliberal intelligentsia, to be used for the positioning. So I will slightly read here in order to keep up with time, because Marin is busy. So okay. So first, generally speaking, in Eastern European context, these fluctuating uses of Jewishness cannot be attributed solely to individual voluntary choices. These choices were shaped by externally imposed interpretative frameworks of social reality, which were deeply intertwined with major historical conditions. And key moments to understand this situation, even if we are thinking earlier about what I just mentioned, Polish bourgeois, affected particularly by these moments in the recent Polish history. The establishment of the Second Republic of Poland, which was already, as you remember from my previous seminars, in my opinion, the republic run and led by the intelligentsia. Then imposition of communism after World War II, and then the fall of communism in 1989. And the recent revival of Jewishness emerged political shifts in Eastern Europe is more understandable when it is examined, especially in the context of this region, integration of Western core countries. Yes. And a crucial dimension of this convergence, central to my analysis, is from the ideological justification point of view, is of this integration of Eastern Europe towards core countries, so Central and Eastern European semi-peripheral countries being politically, culturally, and economically in the process of integration with the Western world. It was, among other ideological components, legitimized as so-called civilizational mission. I've been talking about this situation here as well. Yes. The very premises of the civilizational mission assumes that Eastern European countries were in several regards backward type of underdeveloped part of Europe, which required certain process of education, adaptation, which was called, among other scholars by Attila Melek and others, as a civilizational mission, yes, which has been carried out here, particularly by the liberal-oriented intelligentsia. However, even if we consider a nationalist, conservative-oriented intelligentsia currents of Polish intelligentsia, they were still in their political strategies oriented towards even questioning, criticizing, but still that was the major point of reference for them. Yes, this civilizational ideological efforts, which organized symbolic field of politics in Poland after communist fall. Civilizational mission claims making third, political and institutional with the West. And it reinforced material ideological dependencies of central institutions. So, part of the consequences of this were reinforcement of the dominance of the local intelligentsia elites, which was criticized as comprador elites and so on and so forth. Yes, and they mediated interest between Western capital, European democratic structure, and the local populations. Yes, that was the role of them, and it is still. This civilizational change, of course, helped local intelligentsia to position itself as a natural leader in shaping and navigating the modernization transformations affecting Eastern European nations. Yes, and I'm quite deliberately avoiding the situation of very much familiar with, also with similar, clearly to what I have learned from my different joint colleagues in similar extent with this situation. 1989 intelligentsia role as an it was particularly evident in of its liberal faction. And for this fraction, challenging Polish nationalism and rooting Polish entity in both a central tenet historical civilization, reproaching the competitors out of joint with the modern world, of an authentic aspiration toward Europeanism. Yes, and Europeanism, of course, tolerant and ready to be inclusive for all different types of not only ethnic identities, but all possible identities, as we know. This civilizational mission concept obviously was a sort of empty signifier, very nebulous, very unclear, very arbitrarily picked up, and it constituted a certain horizon of impossibility. Yes, we were always gravitationally pulled by this civilizational horizon, but we were never able to reach this, obviously. And this also constituted the very position to reproduce the hegemonic position of intelligentsia, because it was required forever, yes? Because this civilizational horizon was never achieved, really. So it was ever elusive of horizon of civilizational maturity, yes? Confronted with however, this civilizational mission was not solely reactionary or oppositional. It also encompassed proactive, politically engaged campaigns led by the intelligentsia to advocate for the rights of various minority groups, including political, ethnic, religious, sexual, and so on. And the success of these campaigns were often heralded as markers of civilizational maturity. Yes. A phrase frequently invoked in public discourse to signify alignment with the vaguely defined European norms. Now, this is also important to see this civilizational mission, which were designed to reforms through the ideology of civilizational progress, that they also went along with profound socio-economic crisis of the 1990s in Eastern Europe. And this crisis played also a significant role in the rediscovery of Jewishness among some of individuals, which I'm analyzing in this research. So the region experiences, as we know, a turbulent transition from state-controlled economies to market-driven systems. And this crisis destabilized, besides economic system, marked by collapse of sectors, the widespread unemployment, and so on and so forth, particularly of subjective identity. Eastern European countries. Subjectivities established during the communist era and even inherited from earlier periods of Polish history began to fragment. And this fragmentation compelled individuals to reimagine or reaffirm their identities and locate themselves within the emerging normative order. Notably, these collective civic identities were articulated not only in political terms, but also along class, status, and ethnic lines. And within this broader context, defined by pressures on normative codes, the reconfiguration of collective identities and the enthusiastic embrace of Western-born emancipatory ideologies as new tools for reformulating citizenship norms. Here we need to see also the resurgence of interest in Jewish heritage. And this resurgence manifested through personal rediscoveries of Jewish identity, not only as an ethnic category, but also an expression of status and political worldview. And this is quite important. So alongside efforts to rebuild Jewish institutions, or surge in journalistic and academic engagement, and so on, this status and symbolic revival is also important to understand. So we see that this context of the geopolitical change is crucially important to understand these individual rediscoveries and sometimes complete rediscoveries, because many of those people who claim that they are members of the Jewish community or they converted to Judaism and so on, they could have Jewish ancestors as far back away as in 19th century. And even in this 19th century, those people who were at that time Jewish, they converted to Catholicism and they chose as their understandable and comprehensible identity Polishness. Yes. So this return to Jewishness is marked after like over 100 years, yes, in case of some of these families. And as it was in late 19th century, that the choice of Polishness among some of those analyzed Jewish origin bourgeois families was marked by their choice of rationality and modernization, because at that time Jewishness, in many respects, constituted something as a constraint to modernization, at least for these cosmopolitan bourgeois families. And Polishness seemingly was more convenient. But even in that situation and in the current post-communist false situation, the major reason of this choice was not only individual, voluntary, but it was significantly conditioned by the geopolitical context. At that time, Polishness was more suitable in this regard, and these days, Jewishness seems to be more suitable. So we are not talking only about ethnicity as such, but we are also talking about a certain symbolic component for status positioning. Now, and even if we are thinking about those specific sectors, I don't have time, obviously, to talk about this. But I mentioned earlier that those Jews who left in Poland, and some of them were kicked out after 1968 and anti-Semitic campaign, they considered themselves Poles, but this Polishness was somehow accompanied by the choice of socialist modernization categories. They were basically communists who believed that nationalist component is a backward type of component, not really important. But their children these days, who are children or grandchildren of those communists who chosen socialist modernization identity and left behind the Jewishness a certain degree also of backwardness, as Polishness also is backwardness, because the collective identity should have been identified in class terms and not necessarily with backward type of or outdated ethnic terms. These days, they are also choosing Jewishness. And also, in the case of this generation of the communists, it was conditioned not by the voluntary choices, but the certain geopolitical positions with the leading position of the Soviet Union, of course, which conditioned position also of Poland. Now, but also for those communities, Jewishness was abandoned in favor of the more socially advantageous Polishness in the early 20th century. Yes. So, in contrast, contemporary Poland has witnessed the emergence of Jewishness as a symbol of social innovation, prompting some individuals to reconnect with and revive long-forgotten family traditions. The symbolic power of Jewishness, among other cultural markers, have proven particularly potent in a society predominantly influenced by the imaginations and values of the intelligentsia. Here is the handy comparison of the ongoing articulation of symbol legitimizing status hierarchy in contemporary Poland comes, and this is produced specifically for you because you were exposed to my previous research of the feudal noble resources. So this is pretty much similar in this regard, yes? This invocation of relic identities, including those tied to the feudal past. Yes? This is the similar way. So deliberate use of feudal symbolic resources, such as interactions with aristocratic families during publicly funded ceremonial events, or the conspicuous display of noble origin artifacts during national festivals and so on. I propose to identify them as a totemic practice, yes, in a Durkheimian way. And these practices evoke a sense of moral forces associated with ancient glory in this regard, of the aristocratic past, imbuing participants with a shared sense of prestige and identity. And such invocations have consistently shaped status hierarchies within the Polish intelligentsia, as you remember, from the era of the Second Republic of Poland through the contemporary Third Republic of Poland. And this post-feudal imagery, coupled with the actual intertwining of elite intelligentsia circles with and Polish aristocracy milieu, continues to function as a legitimizing symbolic resource for asserting claims to national leadership. Yes. So these claims are often grounded in a vision of ancient roots that reinforce historical continuity and prestige. And similarly, the strategic deployment of Jewishness serves to maintain or elevate the intelligentsia status within the shifting ideological parameters of the civilizational mission I've just described, adapted by country aligning with Western core nations. Yes? And unlike feudal elite imagery, Jewishness evokes a distinct set of symbolic associations. It operates within the status hierarchies shaped by neoliberal transformations. In post-1989 Poland, amidst the dislocation of normative frameworks, Jewishness emerged in public debates as one of several potent symbols, for instance, alongside markers like LGBT rights, linked to modernization and emancipation from the perceived constraints of parochial Polish culture. Yes. And this culture was often framed as misaligned, this parochial Polish culture, obviously, with mainstream civilizational development, with the new civilizational mission envisioned as correcting this misalignment. Yes. Now, I'm trying to conclude now this preliminary notes. with the major argument. So, regardless of the ideological content attached to Jewishness throughout the 20th century in Polish society, its symbolic significance has been far from trivial, especially within the semi-peripheral context, limiting material and class-based resources utility as robust assets for status position. Yes. So we are talking again and again with the situation in Eastern Europe, which underpinned all social problems. At least this is my opinion. Lack of money. Yes, lack of money, lack of capital. And in this sense, we can see as a compensatory those all symbolic things. If you lack money, you go for fantasies. Yes. So this amplifies the importance of symbolic and cultural capital in maintaining social distinctions, which under certain conditions can also facilitate capital conversion. So we also need to see this, that once you have efficient symbolic and cultural resources, you can, as Pierre Bourdieu on a number of occasions demonstrated, you can transfer them also to material capital, even though in a limited sense, but still, even if you act as a comprador class only. But still, comprador class has greater resources, material resources, due to the efficient conversion from symbolic, valuable resources than those who are not using these valuable symbolic resources. So in line with Durkheimian perspective here, which emphasizes the enduring relevance of totemic figures in constructing moral community boundaries, uses of Jewishness can be understood as a part of the reproduction processes of intelligentsia hegemony, particularly that of its liberal faction. And for these groups, specifically individuals, organizations, and material artifacts, like Museum of History of Polish Jews, for instance, as well as imagined elements of Jewish ancestry, evoked imageries of progressiveness, which in turn reinforced the moral boundaries of the communities and their identity as leaders of modernization, positioning themselves against forces perceived as anti-modernization, often framed under the umbrella symbols of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. So Jewishness as a point of reference of social progress within the liberal intelligentsia civilizational mission not only exemplified Poland's post-1989 convergence with core Western countries, but also served, and this is crucial for this paper, to legitimize the reproduction of the privileged position of this social group. I'm not talking, of course, about Jewish intelligentsia or anything like this. I'm talking only about the Polish liberal intelligentsia, which uses this just to reinforce their position. And this is not the only symbolic resource being used in the greater field of symbolic relevance in today's Poland, obviously. I'm just narrowing this as an example, empirical example, of course. And this reproduction relied on a strategy of symbolic capital acquisition under the guise of altruism, which is a typical situation for Polish intelligence. And this altruism means that we are so, how to say, altruistic towards backward type of population that we are bringing them into civilizational mission in order to increase their Europeanness and in order to become more humane, better citizens. But this type of strategy only masked, and I'm following here Pierre Bourdieu's ideas of uses of symbolic capital, which typically, when it is used as an altruistic component, in fact, it only masks the intelligentsia pursuit of its own hegemonic status. So Jewishness in this sense emerged, and this is the last sentence, as a contingent totemic figure within Poland's modernization efforts, deeply influenced by its geopolitical context, which these days is heavily affected by neoliberal Western hegemony. Thank you very much for your attention, and my apologies for stealing your time a little bit more than expected. Thank you.
Thank you. We thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I will leave the ones who are in the room to give you who have questions there. I don't see online. If there is anyone online, please raise your hand.
I have a bunch of things.
If you can put the microphone a bit on the middle of the table, so that no, the microphone that's on the table towards the
Richard, we are having a few questions here, so maybe we take first from the floor, and later we turn into
quite good.
internet-based.
Yeah.
All right.
I wonder if this Jewishness is so singular as a kind of paradigm in such a rediscovery of important social capital for the collective identities in Poland. In Romania, for instance, similar prestige is that of the Saxon minority in Transylvania, which after the collapse of communism was also rediscovered and taken as a
Klaus Johannes, for instance.
of course, until my question is your approach is based on Jewishness only as an ethnic background, say, probably comparable with other ethnic groups or identities in such a context, or other minorities could also be referred to in Poland.
Very good question, particularly with the Saxon example. I haven't studied this in more detail, but as you know, symbolic resources related to Germany after the Second World War in Poland do not constitute particularly prestigious symbolic resources.
Many localities in Romania were simply renamed in German terms after the 1990s.
And this demonstrates the particular and contingent nature of those processes being carried out in Eastern Europe, where Jewishness in Polish case is more suitable to be used as this totemic resource.
Why totemic? Why totemic?
Totemic as any totemic resource according to the Durkheimian position, which can be contingently used anything which has certain degree of efficient, reliable resonance with lived experience and expectation about prestige, positioning, those which gives a sense of social energies, as Durkheim called this. And in this sense, there is nothing essentialist in Jewishness, obviously, as it is nothing essentialist in Germany, just in Germaniness, or whatever would be the proper English term for this sense. But the historical conditions and the historical evolution of our regional history went different, where Jewishness may be used, and remember, this is not the only symbolic resource which might be used in these games. I just mentioned about this pre-modern aristocratic, for instance, resources which are also used quite extensively. Therefore, I'm trying to explain this position from the structural kind of post-Marxist point of view, that the lack of capital resources which constitutes the proper deficiency of the field of power in Eastern Europe turns attention more frequently that is being used in the places in the West or in the core countries, as Immanuel Wallerstein would have it, where the material capital is more significantly shaping the power relations. In Eastern Europe, it is not necessarily very common, therefore, that we are using those existing reliable symbolic resources which are at hand, and due to very complex, which would require further empirical investigation, why exactly this one and not exactly this one can constitute available at this moment under certain circumstances. And I'm claiming this Jewishness is helpful due to hegemonic position of the Polish neoliberal intelligentsia. Yes. They are more important than any other section of Polish intelligentsia, and for them, Jewishness comes as help, particularly fighting against their proper competitor to the position, which is the Polish nationalist conservative intelligentsia, yes. And blaming them, for instance, for anti-Semitism or some xenophobic tones and so on is also useful. So we need this diachronic. But thank you for this, because this demonstrates a limited usage of my example for Eastern Europe, yes. That probably in Romania it wouldn't be so useful. But in Polish context is useful due to historical legacies, yes. Thank you very much, Marin, for this important remark.
Other questions from the room?
I think we have one.
I think we were having a bunch.
Oh.
Okay, I have also here. Okay, when you are ready there, I could.
So, I mean, I had quite a few questions, comments, arguments, critiques, you name it. Yeah. We can go on afterwards, perhaps, a little bit. One of my curiosities, this is more of a question than a comment, is since you are talking about class formation and early class formation, right? And you pointed out that the Jewish and German population in early Poland had a particular position in accumulating capital that allowed them to transform into a kind of bourgeois, proper bourgeois class. Was it early 19th century?
Late 19th. In the Kingdom of Poland, also not in every possible Polish territory.
So my first curiosity would be, how would you explain the kind of mechanisms of primitive accumulation? Let's give it to the Marxian rather than post-Marxian field for the time being, that allowed these particular types of groups to accumulate into consolidated capital. This would be one. And if I may stay into the kind of more materialist possible angle of approaching such a rather vast subject, when you, so right, I mean, any reader of Marxian literature, the moment when confronted with a more sort of symbolic Bourdieusian analysis will tackle you for not being materialist enough, right? This is what I'm doing now. So you are mentioning the return of Jewishness as this kind of mechanism, simple kind of symbolic mechanism, by which a certain portion of the Polish intelligence, right, it's kind of making a move to consolidate its symbolic rather than economic or political position, right? Of course, symbolic, this kind of symbolic capital is convertible into political capital and, of course, into economic capital. But if we are looking at a broader resurgence of select types of, well, ethnic, religious, collective identities throughout Europe, one of the things that is quite common is certain types of investments, right, from core external countries. Israel might be one of the cases in Poland, but I'm thinking more of an example like Christian Gotze wrote a very, very nice article called Minarets After Marx about the resurgence of a particular type of Islamic kind of Salafi orientation among the Pomak minority in Bulgaria. And that is kind of a straight up post-industrial ruination that is afterwards counterbalanced by massive investments in culture, in infrastructure, and even direct FDI.
By Saudi Arabia and other guys.
But Saudi Arabia via Turkey, right? Yeah, so I'm also curious about the particular kinds of mechanisms that are monetary and material that allow or enable a particular vision of Jewishness to be the adequate symbolic.
Beautiful thing. Let's stop here, otherwise I get lost with this.
Let me just point out that the Germanness, the Saxonness that Marina also mentioned, is also one of the pipelines of foreign investment in parts of Transylvania and in Banat in Western Romania, where I'm working.
Given that I've been increasingly more and more materialistic oriented in studying Eastern Europe and see this material infrastructure as the key thing to understand many of symbolic space, to use it Lacanian category to describe understanding for this. I'm very happy to hear your questions because they help me, particularly as I mentioned, very early stage. Yes, I just collected some data. By the way, what is your name?
Adrian.
Adrian. So thank you, Adrian, for this great question. Starting with this capitalization processes according to the classical Marxist interpretation. That was actually something interesting, very interesting. I'm trying to narrow myself in order not to go too fast with answering. Why Jews and Germans in the first place, and why they even nicely overperformed Polish aristocracy, which was historically speaking in the privileged position to accumulate capital in Polish historical lands, but this was based mainly, as we know, on agriculture-based economy, which got somehow outdated during the analyzed period when the new modernization phase and industrialization phase of capitalism was involved at that time. This was heavily also related, we have to see this, sorry for extending a little bit this point, but this is a nice and maybe it will be also interesting for other colleagues here. It had also something to do with the changing policies of the Tsarist regime at the time, which realized that it dramatically needs, we would call it these days, foreign capital investments. In order to have these foreign capital investments, they needed to change their tariff policies. And these tariff policies contributed to inflow of material capital or investment capital, particularly going to two major industrial zones in the Russian Empire. One was located in the historical Polish lands, that is, so to speak, Zagłębie Dąbrowsko, Sosnowieckie, that was a mining area. Another was Łódź, where the cotton industry was starting. At the same time, more or less, Manchester and other places were doing the same thing. And these tariff policies were very liberal. And therefore, this explains why Germans came over. So this accumulation of capital was actually taking first place in Germany, and they just came over because they were attracted by the very preferential terms laid by Russian Empire. Extremely. Therefore, this accumulation of capital was on unprecedented scale, even by European standards at that time. Therefore, they were building impressive, spectacular palaces. They were reinvesting this money here and there. So I understand. Why Jewishness? Also very, very interesting question. So Germans, they were basically just coming over because they couldn't be out of, this also requires further research, why they were actually staying in Łódź and so on, because they settled down. Also, that is important. It is different category of this today's direct financial investments, which means that they are basically transferring money, but they are living in New York City or whatever. But at that time, they were also settling. Therefore, in the longer diachronic run, their offspring got polarized, yes, and eventually constitute major figures from the pantheon of Polish intelligentsia, particularly after the Second World War. Jewishness, or Jewry, they were smart people in terms of finding their place in feudal environment of early 19th century, which helped them somehow to create first banking houses, which constitute this early stage of capitalization. And later on, when the second generation was confronted with the new Tsarist policies, which started around 1864 and specifically 1870 onwards. So it lasted until the First World War, which marks general destruction of the previous fortunes and everything. But this early capitalization due to this little banking system then reinvested in the cotton industries, mining industries, steel industries, ore industries, created more or less competitive position of capital accumulation to those direct investments coming from the German communities. Yes, and this also therefore outperformed Polish aristocrats, which first of all were hesitant to invest in modern industries, which were not very much familiar with. They didn't have much practice with this because they've been always, like for ages, only associated with land-based agriculture type. And they had enormous land properties, but they were still, in terms of modern capitalists, not very competitive. But still, because we are creating now like a list of most significant Polish bourgeois figures of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Most of them are Jewish and Germans. But there are still few Polish aristocratic families which joined this capitalist renewal, and they were also doing relatively well. But there were just a few of them. Concerning the second important question, how it looks like when, for instance, symbolic resources related to Saxon legacy help also in a material sense to channel certain real, tangible material resources. I would say that there is a certain degree, of course, transfer of real, genuine money coming from the Western world to these Jewish-based organizations and different initiatives related to them, but they are not a proper economic enterprises. Yes, these are more like NGOs and all this stuff. So they constitute only the reproduction of the hegemony of the intelligentsia, because they are still need to be seen as a comprador class in this regard. Yes, they are not starting producing or innovating in the new technologies and things like this. Yes, this is a proper comprador class, which finds ways, of course, due to its prominence and symbolic spectacularity, to resources coming from the West, quite significantly. But additionally, I would say also, most of money they are receiving actually are from Polish budget. I mean, they are doing great job also in terms of accumulating money from Polish budget, Polish state. Yes. However, this money in any respects cannot be compared to this capital accumulation, which was the case of late 19th century, which was related actually to the innovating in the industrial revolution of that time capitalist economy, yes, which was something else. So in this regard, the previous chapter of the evolution of Polish Jews and Polish Germans were much more successful in many respects. Also in the respects when we are thinking about class stratification. Yes. Because these days we are just talking about the pure reproduction of the comprador intelligentsia class, which uses available symbolic resources, but they are not really economically innovative. So from the materialist point of view, not particularly impressive. Not particularly impressive. But thank you very much for this question, because it helps me out also to go further. Thank you. I think Richard.
Yeah, okay. If there are no more from the room, can I ask you also something? I don't know if there are also online.
I think you can.
Yeah, okay. So I could also crystallize better then. Oops, there is a strong noise there. Yeah. Okay. If you move the microphone, then it's this noise. Very.
I do have it in front of my face.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was okay, but we could hear you very well also before when you were talking online. I would have three big question. Let's say this way, starting for the first one and. Connecting to your last remarks, I mean, you said at the beginning something that you will concentrate on the part of Poland that was in Russian Empire. So, and there were, of course, the other two parts, right, in German and in the
Austria.
yeah, Austrian, right? And is there why did you do this, and what is the weight for your argument? I cannot see that it's a weight for your argument now. Very, I mean, to concentrate there. I mean, what's the difference? Then the second question is related to kind of let's say more extended view of this for Eastern Europe. I mean, what you noticed, it's not particular to Poland. I mean, I could observe it also in there are probably not for sure not this scale also, but it is also in Romania. I mean, I'm more familiar with some with the Jewish community from Romania and also from Germany, and I could see this in Easterners that would like to become Jewish, and there is such a move, right? I don't know what's the scale there, and for this I would also put you the question: what kind of data did you use, and where did you collect your data? Right? Did you got to the Jewish communities to see how many, or did you got to somehow apply the right to
Right.
intelligentsia or some sort? So I would be interested in this. And third question is regarded to a kind of amendment, or I cannot see the range of your argument. I mean, I would restrict it. I mean, there is, let's say, or the question would be, what there is also an anti-Semitism, right, in Poland that it's promoted or so of part of intelligentsia, right? So
Yeah.
you might not do this argument so extend here. So this will reduce the extension of your argument. Could you tell me what's your take on this part? Right?
Yes. Okay. So let's start one by one. The first one, why this specific part of partitioned Poland was chosen. Due to the various reasons, a number of reasons, obviously. First, because the Russian part of historical Polish lands was the greatest, yes, in terms of territories and major also centers. It constitute over 88% of the former Polish territories, yes. Wow. So everything was there in a way, yes. Secondly, because the major economic establishment of this bourgeois class and the economic bonanza took place also there, right? Mm-hmm. Prussia and Austro-Hungarian territories were even not close in this regard for this sort of investments. They constituted rather peripheral areas of Prussian and Austro or Habsburg Empire. And there were no major establishments, industrial establishments and stuff. So Łódź, Warszawa, Zagłębie, Sosnowiecko-Dąbrowieckie, these were major regions also from the point of view of St. Petersburg at that time, economic policies. So that was really important, yes. So this other part of Polish historical territories would methodologically complicate things. So we decided actually to concentrate on the Russian Empire part. Now, what were the material or empirical basis for doing this stuff? First were interviews with the current and historical Jewish organizations existing in Poland. Yes, so we had close to 100 interviews which gather more or less representative individuals from these groups. Then we also covered all existing institutions, revived, and also public figures of Jewish origin who identified themselves as Jews, because there may be many people of Jewish origin, but they are not using this. So we didn't approach them, obviously, right? Because they are not happy with being considered as Jewish. So we don't need to reveal the Jewishness, as they are not willing to be understood as such. Further, we are working also on archives, particularly related to this period of the late 19th century and early 20th century, which are, of course, limited, problematic, and so on. But it is better than nothing, right? You need to do this. Therefore, we are doing this, for instance, this list of the wealthiest industrialists or people who lived in the Kingdom of Poland under the Tsarist Empire at that time, until the establishment of the Second Republic of Poland in 1918, to demonstrate how this class emerged, evolved, and how it faced its decline, final decline, yes, with the Bolshevik Revolution and later with the actual establishment of the Second Republic of Poland, which was already this intelligentsia project, not to mention about the People's Republic of Poland. Yes. And the third one related to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been beautifully actually researched and studied in Poland. So in terms of state of the art, there is a wealth, a great deal of things. So we are actually... obviously, when it is necessary, we are trying to use and interpret and use existing literature concerning Polish anti-Semitism and how it impacted also this interesting aspects of our research. But our research is something else, right? So we don't need necessarily to compete with the beautiful literature related to this, but we are trying to fill in a gap which hasn't been really researched. That is this legacy of Polish Jewish bourgeois, which these days constitute sort of lost Atlantis in a way, yes? Not too many people are even aware about the existence of such a wealthy group which was well able to compete with their Western counterparts at that time. And even including the members of this family. Sometimes for them it is insignificant. And why it is insignificant? Because of this intelligentsia hegemony also. Yes. For whom material resources and associated with this potential prestige is not significant. It's not totemic, to use this Durkheimian argument. Yes, it cannot be used as such. Because there were, for instance, such a very famous and wealthy Natanson family in Poland, major capitalist family. And there are still people who are members of this family in contemporary Poland, hardline type of intelligentsia members, of course. So for them, this banking, industrial legacy of their family is completely insignificant. Yes? They hardly even mention this. They don't care whatsoever. And imagine the same situation with the Rothschild house in the West, that they would have just abandoned their legacy. It is impossible. But in the Intelligentsia Republic, it is even more than possible. For them, it is even somehow problematic to refer to this bourgeois legacy of their family. Therefore, we are not dealing necessarily with the anti-Semitic component of this field of research, because it is of marginal importance for this particular line of inquiry, even though we are referring and citing and so on, of course, some work related to this. Thank you, Richard, as always, for your very important and inspiring questions.
Yeah.
We have a question also here.
Please.
At the table.
Excuse me, because my hearing is not so good.
Pe ce?
What is the situation of Malinowski?
Bronisław Malinowski.
Malinowski. Is it assimilated by Polish culture? May one speak about Malinowski before 89? I have a comparison with Romanian Mircea Eliade.
Yes.
Mircea Eliade was interdicted a long period of time before 89.
Yes.
Yes. Especially he was accepted only as a writer, as a literary author. But his famous studies in history of religions was almost zero.
Yes.
before 89. Now, what is the situation
with Bronisław Malinowski? Bronisław Malinowski, according to my knowledge, I'm not an anthropologist myself, okay? But what I know, and I haven't studied this in more detail, reading of Bronisław Malinowski, referring to Bronisław Malinowski was pretty much all the time uninterrupted, also during the communist time. Because he was neutral in many respects, and it was not very much, how to say, suspicious, also ideologically, regardless of the given historical moment of the post-communist and post-communist times. Whether he is a major point of reference in our today's anthropological, probably is not perceived as an ultra-revolutionary, an innovative author, but he was definitely not suppressed, put on censorship index, anything like this. Yes, so he was still around. He has been still around, and he's still relatively famous and important. So in this regard, situation of Mircea Eliade might have been different compared to Bronisław Malinowski or Florian Znaniecki and others, classical figures, yes, which were pretty much all the time. So the study about Polish peasant and other, which was done by Znaniecki, were also there. Thank you very much for your question.
I have here a review of a very interesting book which appeared under the auspices of European Association of Social Anthropologists. And
thank you.
Yes. We'll see. You will see.
Okay.
We'll see.
Thank you.
It is a review which was requested from me by an Italian journal. They imposed to me a very limited number of words. Yes, and this is my enlarged review, which I have published on European anthropology.
Good to know.
It's a book. Usually
Could you move a bit to the microphone towards Professor Jan, please?
Yes.
Yeah, because we can hear him only. Yeah, thanks.
And to diminish the personality of Malinowski, but it was speak also others who made work or participate or long etc.
Yes.
The review of mine of Malinowski. Yes.
Thank you so much. Yes. I enjoy the reading of Malinowski pieces,
Yeah.
and I find him still relevant. not.
Please consider together with
Yes.
as two fathers, the modern, Yes.
See, I think there were at London School of Economics, actually, it's international conference, I think, about legacy, so a certain degree of scientific relevance. He studied, of course, so in this regard, to do with yeah, around also several things organized around him in Poland, but also during the communism as well. So we didn't need to rediscover his writings in this regard. Yes. Thank you very much. So are we having any other?
No, I think
We are done.
Okay, thank you very much. There are no other question there. I think online we don't have, or no, there is nobody. So thanks again, and we're wishing you good luck further with the study, and let us know how it goes. Right? If you manage, I'm happy that you managed to come to present it here, because I know there are problems with. With this exchange.
Yeah, but we somehow miraculously overcome these issues. So hopefully the next stage of this research, which is now, as you know, full evolving and everything here looks promising. Maybe the next stage I will be also able to share first with you. Yes, later, maybe later this year.
Yeah.
Who knows? Thank you very much for organizing this, and most notably, thank you for your questions. Thank you. Very inspiring, and thank you also. I'm showing to other colleagues online that I just received this articles, which I will be reading on way back to Poland.
Good. Thanks, and have a nice trip back. I hope we could, our academy will restart the normal course of the exchange between the Polish and the Polish academy, because Marcin also wanted to visit in March, and he couldn't because he was coming with a lot of students, and didn't have to postpone him to. I hope.
Maybe later this year it will be also possible.
Right. We hope.
We try to twice a year, so maybe visit will. But this one was by Alexandra, basically as good as.
we should have a body.
There is a bug. So why? As Benjamin Disraeli say, no complaint.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a nice day further, and bye bye.
So,